I'm going to be talking today to a special guest, and we're going to be talking about the US elections scheduled later this year. I don't know uh, a US election in the recent history that's created this much anxiety almost as this one has. And we're also going to be talking especially um, to the media's role in covering the US elections, how the US news media have shaped themselves in covering politics over the Trump era, over the 4 years, because there's been a lot of lessons that we hope the media have learned. And specifically, we will introduce a concept that I'm going to be calling claim to representation, how the news media essentially has this self-conferred function of, it's almost a privilege, I call it, which is that it claims to represent um, the audiences, whether it's a reflection of facts or whether it should be a representation of sentiment, that kind of thing we will also discuss. And inevitably, we're going to talk about what the news media did in 2016, how it got it all wrong, and has the news media really changed, and what should have changed after that fiasco in 2016. Well, talking to me is going to be Professor William Freivogel. He's the former director at the Department of Journalism, but he's a full professor at the same department at the Southern Illinois University at Carbondale. He was for a long time the Washington correspondent and the assistant bureau chief at the St. Louis Post-Dispatch. He's covered the Supreme Court, so he's a legal expert as well, and reported on such historic events as the assassination attempt on President Reagan. In his early years in Washington, Bill won the Emory A. Brownell Award for his influential stories and returned then to St. Louis to become the deputy editorial page editor in 1997. His editorials on former Attorney General John Ashcroft, we remember him, and the Constitution made him a finalist in the 2002 Pulitzer Prize competition. You can't get better than that. He also won Sigma Delta Chi's top award in 1991 for a series on Bill of Rights, and shared the Sidney Hillman Award for a series on civil rights policy changes during the Reagan administration. Bill was the main contributor for a 1987 project that won him the Benjamin Franklin Award as the best newspaper series for the best newspaper series on the bicentennial of the Constitution. Now, there's a news media privilege that I'd like to call claim to representation, but in the meantime, we can stop sharing this. The news media believe they represent the viewer, and therefore the citizen, the voter, and so forth. And that's what we're going to really be talking about, notwithstanding that role defined by themselves, or at best by the Hutchins Commission way back in 1947. The media got it wrong in 2016, and much of that blame must go to bad representation. That time, 4 years ago, the media could pass on a part of the blame onto the bots in the new media, such as Facebook, which had us all fooled into being misled. And at that time, Bill and I had talked about this. He was my interviewee also at that time, and this time we're going to talk about whether media are reflecting facts that are popular, or are they representing public sentiment as reflected on social media. And today I want to welcome Bill to this video. Bill, welcome, and good morning to you.
Good morning to you, and thanks for having me on.
Sure, Bill. So as I was telling the folks that are watching this, at that time, if you remember, Bill, I wanted to understand whether the media exercise their own ideological bias in their discourse, omitting important or less understood human factors that may not have been articulated at that time. We discussed, and you shed light on how investigative journalism was not at its best, to say the least, and because field journalism had taken a back seat, a lot the media actually missed a lot in 2016. The broader concern was to identify a new phenomenon that this is, that gap between the reality and what the media reflected as their images, and especially I would say the television media and the electronic media, but also including the print media to which you have largely belonged. We want to see whether things have changed from there, and that basically led us in 2016, if you remember, to address the question: how do media and social media narratives contribute to the silencing of a majority voter base in the U.S. presidential election, which of course President Trump won. The U.S. 2020 election is exciting to me because of the promise of a contrast. Have the media reinvented themselves by plugging obvious loopholes? We want to begin by taking stock of the media. And so that is why this debate to me is, or the discussion to me is so important. Now, I want to start with the more conceptual premise, and then we'll come to the 2020 election, because the news media, they claim to represent our society. And one of the biggest debates around the media in this century has been that they have been ratings driven. I mean, one way or the other, right? This century, and certainly, I mean, that's nothing new in the US for sure. Ratings have been around for a while now. But it's easy to argue that by being driven by popular news, is it a problem? I mean, is it not debatable that popular news should be less problematic than being influenced by the deep pockets of advertising, for example? Is that not more problematic? Covering stories on the basis of trending news-related tweets, for example, should be an example of the democratization of news rather than the opposite. So why do many scholars find this kind of claim of ratings drivenness really problematic?
Well, I agree with you that the U.S. media does claim for itself a certain role in our democracy that, I mean, for one thing, it's laid out in the Constitution. I mean, the press is the only business that's mentioned in the U.S. Constitution. It's one of the 5 protections of the First Amendment, and the Supreme Court itself has in some of its decisions recognized that the press is a sort of a fourth estate. That they're a watchdog when the president and Congress maybe are of the same party and doing things that need to be disclosed. I mean, the particular case in which the Supreme Court, this role of the press was recognized, was the Pentagon Papers case way back in the 1970s, when Daniel Ellsberg released 45-volume classified history of the Vietnam War that basically showed American presidents had lied about it. And Justice Potter Stewart, in his important decision in that case, wrote at length about the role that the press plays in democracy as sort of the eyes and ears of the people. I mean, we like to think about ourselves as sort of standing in the shoes of the American people. We can be there and witness things firsthand that oftentimes they might have the opportunity to do as they go about their everyday business. But have the as you say, the press certainly didn't recognize the prospect that Donald Trump had to win the election. I mean, we should remember that he got 3 million fewer votes than Hillary Clinton, and it's sort of our electoral college system that that resulted in his election. So in some ways, the opinion polls weren't as far off as we sometimes think. But certainly the media didn't understand a lot of the the people who maybe Hillary Clinton unfortunately referred to at one point as a basket of deplorables. People who lived in small town America, rural America. I saw them sometimes referred to as people who were sort of the loose change of society, who felt they had been forgotten by the people who ran the country in Washington and the big cities. And there were efforts by the press, particularly after that 2016 election, to say, oh, let's go talk to these people. What is it that they are concerned about? And but I'm not I really don't think that the press understands those folks any better today than it did in 2016. I mean, in some ways, there's more, the CNNs and the MSNBCs, the big cable organizations have moved farther to the left and where they're more representative of the big cities.
Let's come to that in a bit. Actually, let me explore that concept a little bit more. Because one counter to the claim of this public representation, which the media you say constantly get wrong, that the idea that somehow they represent everybody, and they fail in doing that, but simply because sometimes the coverage is not good enough, and therefore as you said, they don't understand every segment of the population. One thing that would counter that would be news bias, and the entire theory of bias in media. I mean, who better to talk about than yourself? But whether these biases arise from marketing influences, for example, I mean, it could be as simple as that therefore there could be systemic kind of imperatives, or owner imperatives, or ownership imperatives, or even editorial slants, which could be so inherent that they're often inevitable. But they could be structural, such the kind of gatekeeping theories that in 1950 they talked about, where simply the news selection contributes to a certain amount of bias. Or it could be guided, where a channel, for example, would deliberately invite a weaker representative of the political party, like a political spokesperson who's not as articulate as the more powerful opponent. That kind of bias has become an accepted characteristic of media systems, including the US media system. And increasing the norm, by the way, for your information, in the Indian media system. I mean, so we're not learning the right things about the US media systems. But in addition to this kind of bias, there's also what I'm calling a strategic bias. I'm not calling it that. I'm just mentioning it right now. The strategic bias sways with popular sentiment. In India, for example, we're not really exposed to live US news television, but in India, there's a popular sentiment that's going one way, and the news media seems to follow that sentiment. And at the moment, the sentiment seems to be largely, as far as we understand from the media, ironically enough, we have to understand this from the media where this public sentiment is. But the assumption by the media that the public sentiment lies with, for example, our right-wing Hindu nationalist government, where the public sentiment really seems to be at the moment, at least with the majority. Now, like I said, we're not really exposed to that much US TV, but you did mention CNN. That's something that CNN, the international channel, is something that we do get in India. And we will come to how that has changed. You're just starting to mention that. But how has bias itself played out in general among channels, newspapers, news portals, while they cover elections in general and US elections in particular.
Well, I think what you were saying about ratings, and ratings is really just a measurement that networks use to figure out what's going to sell things. I think ratings do affect the sort of business model of particularly some of these big cable news organizations, and this is true really on both sides of the political spectrum. I mean, Fox News has become far more conservative and basically President Trump's favored news organization, because there's a huge segment of the population who find it to provide the news and information that they agree with. And as I was just saying before, on the other side of that, I think CNN and then MSNBC um, have both built business models that are appealing to the more liberal, urban, cosmopolitan group of people in the United States.
Also on the
And so, yeah, I think the
extreme,
ratings do. Yeah, go ahead.
I was just saying, channels like MSNBC have made it a point to to position themselves in a certain um, um, end of the spectrum itself. So it's no longer just left or right or one or the other. It's a spectrum. It's a continuum almost, because you got so many channels that one might be more moderate than the others. But Bill, sorry, I was just
No, and I mean, I don't want to exaggerate in that I do think CNN and MSNBC and to a lesser extent Fox remain fairly reliable uh, news organizations. But that having been said, there's so much spin in the way the news is portrayed that I think that has gotten much worse since 2016. And has only grown. I think that journalists, if you went back farther than the last 4 years, I think journalists in general have a more liberal bias, just are individually more likely to be liberal, are Democrats. Um, I've seen opinion polls dating back decades, that show a large majority of journalists have a more liberal persuasion. So I think that can't help but affect um, affect the way news is reported. Having said that, I worked for the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, which was Joseph Pulitzer's newspaper for 34 years, and I never had a single story that I wrote that was affected by the commercial interests of the paper. I wrote about Monsanto, McDonnell Douglas, General Dynamics, the biggest corporations in St. Louis, and my stories were not favorable towards them. And nobody ever said, hey, come on, ease up, this is hurting our bottom line. So, I don't think, for example, that Jeff Bezos, who owns the Washington Post and also Amazon, I don't think he affects the way the Washington Post covers Donald Trump. I don't think the Sulzbergers, who own the New York Times, I don't think that they dictate the news coverage. It's the working journalists who report the stories the way they see them. Now they see them very differently than the farmer in the middle of Iowa or Illinois or Missouri. Many of the Midwest American states are they are Democratic strongholds in the cities, and all the rest of the state is a Republican stronghold. That's true in Missouri, for example, where I live.
Um, I mean, it's so interesting. You should mention your own anecdotes in this because I did want to pick your brains a little bit about how things have changed from the time that you, well, from the time that you started reporting all the way till today, 2020. We did this in 2016, didn't we? But now I want to stretch that to 2020. Could you tell us how things have, how reporting has changed, A, and B is also, I mean, beginning 2017, just after the time that you and I talked the last time, the Washington Post and the BBC and a host of the others, having realized their folly in how they predicted the 2016 election, excuse me, they invested in fact-check desks and investigate. They actually, as recently I think as last year, the Washington Post or a bunch of other newspapers invested in investigative desks and reporting. I would have thought that therefore the curve, the decline that I'm sure that we're going to talk about in a minute, would have turned the corner. But you're saying that the it's only slipping further, if I may use that value-laden word, from the way that you've seen it. So could you kind of compare the two, maybe?
Yeah, well, in some ways, when I think back over my 50 years of reporting on politics and on government, some things haven't changed and some things are different like night and day. I mean, the things that haven't changed is, sometimes we talk about the United States being more politically divided into two groups of people than ever before. But, when I started as a reporter, it was the end of the Vietnam War, and the United States was terribly divided. And I mean, there were bombings of the Capitol. There was the Weather Underground. There was, there were riots at the 1968 Democratic Convention, both by demonstrators and then a police counter riot. So, I mean, we were a tremendously divided country then. And, if you think about what President Nixon used to get elected, which was a war on crime and on, on hippies and drugs and appealing to the Southerners on issues of race. I mean, it's exactly what Donald Trump is doing right now. So it's where he's saying the cities are burning. So the civil rights protesters are rioting in the streets. They want to get rid of the suburbs. So like I say, in some ways it's very similar, but in some ways it's entirely different because I mean, social media, we here, and I'm sure you as well in India, are bombarded every day by billions of bits of information, some of it true and much of it false. And I think that that a lot of people who used to believe in the credibility of the press, particularly in the period after the Vietnam War and after Watergate, when the press had a really big role in seeming to restore government, that today the people do not have very much belief in the credibility of the press. And they really, many of my students, I teach a media literacy course, many of my students just throw up their hands. How are we supposed to figure out what to believe? Amidst this flood of information. I mean, we never in the early 1970s when I started, we never would have had stories in the mainstream media about a group like QAnon. I don't know if if in India there's much attention paid to them, but there's this conspiracy theory that a mysterious unnamed person, Q, some people think it's Donald Trump, is saving the United States from Democrats in government who are running a child sex ring out of a pizza parlor in Washington, D.C., and who are actually cannibals. There is a large group of people who believe that this is true. And as a matter of fact, some of them are getting elected as candidates for Congress, and even there will be a QAnon people who are elected to Congress. Now that, back in the 1970s, there's no way anything that QAnon a QAnon type group said would get into the mainstream media. I mean, mostly it gets into the media these days on stories saying this is a conspiracy theory and it's wrong. But still, President Trump, for example, refuses to. I mean, he calls them patriots and says he appreciates their support. You mentioned fact checkers. That there are all sorts of fact checkers now, and that is, they existed before 2016, but have become even more common. But to a certain extent, it seems as though Donald Trump is sort of immune from the findings of fact checkers. The Washington Post fact checkers say Donald Trump has lied 20,000 times in his 4 years, lied or misled the American people 20,000 times in his first term as president of the United States. And it doesn't really seem like people care very much. His supporters. I mean, he still maintains this sort of core 42% approval rating, no matter what he does or says.
So one of the changes that I see, for example, in CNN, because that's the one that I'm observing, but you mentioned before that there's been a change in the way that the media are looking at this. What is this? I mean, I see more emotion in the at least in the panel discussions now. There's more emotion from the anchor, not just from the representatives, not just from the so-called analysts, but the anchors themselves. Clearly, I mean, that is strategic. I understand that, but is that an emotional response to the way that Trump himself is treating the media, or is it and thereby are they kind of shortchanging their viewers, obfuscating them from the actual reality, which might lie neither this side or the other? What do you think there?
Well, I think to a certain extent, the kind of the more aggressive stance you might see from a person like, let's use as an example, Wolf Blitzer, who is a CNN anchor.
Yeah.
And I think he is overall a good news person. But I think, the feeling in 2016 that the press hadn't lived up to its role. The press maybe hadn't called out Donald Trump enough for his lies. I mean, more American people thought that Hillary Clinton lied than Donald Trump in the 2016 election. So I think to a certain extent, the Wolf Blitzers of the world, and I think this also applies to the Washington Post and the New York Times, really reliable newspapers in the United States. I think to a certain extent they felt as though they had to be more explicit in calling out the lies. So you will see Wolf Blitzer immediately say, the president said this, that, and the other today, which is not true. You never would have seen that, I don't think, before 2016. And the New York Times has from time to time said that the president lied. Before they would have said, the president said this, here's what the facts say, and sort of let the reader make up their own mind. I mean, I still, as a traditional journalist, prefer sort of the latter. And because I think to a certain extent, when it's just when a news person feels as though it's their responsibility to call out a lie sort of in real time, it is sort of a little bit of a dangerous road that might lead to a quick judgment by a journalist in front of a camera that they really need more time to think about.
That's right. That's right. So the whole point there is that the media also seem to have carried forward Trump's word, which is lie and liar. If you remember, that's what he called Hillary Clinton in 2016. And somehow this seems to be those kind of value-laden words are kosher, it seems now on mainstream media, as the media themselves use it. I mean, it's not as if, as you said, they're trying to balance two sides and say, this is what they said and this is what this person said, and we're not going to be judging that, but they are starting to judge that. One thing this election has brought up is very significant for some reason for a lot of people sitting here in India, is the fact that Kamala Harris, who's part black, part Indian in ethnicity, is going to be the vice presidential candidate for the Democrats. And Nikki Haley, on the other side, has been propped up by Trump in the in his acceptance speech for nomination, and she made a speech that made no bones of her Indian heritage or Indian ethnicity. Indian media and social media have just gone crazy about that. We're now claiming that both of them are there to win the the Indian electorate, which is basically just about 1.2 to 1.5 million out of more than 153 million registered voters in the United States. So that can be completely true. But the Indian media's claim is also, representing the sentiment, as we were talking about earlier, just trying to milk that for their Indian audiences and Indian readership's sake. In fact, there was a speculation whether an Indian president will emerge in the United States in 2024. How have the U.S. media played on ethnicity over the last 4 years? Because that's something that's become a kind of a sensitive issue in the United States, much more than during the Obama years, for example. Somehow race has re-emerged, although I have to say that the one that started it all happened very close to where you live, in Ferguson, Missouri, and that was during the Obama years. And then somehow it has caught momentum for some reason, and there's a lot of racism now that seems to pervade or has been covered more by the media than before. I don't know what the statistics say. But in your opinion, how important will that be to the election, A? And do you believe that the media are fairly covering the racial tension, or are they being too politically correct about it? Or how do you see that happen?
Well, I mean, you're right that it's really interesting, the Indian heritage of Kamala Harris and Nikki Haley. I mean, you could make a decent argument that there's a greater chance that the first woman president of the United States will end up having Indian heritage than other possible heritages. Because I mean, if Biden's elected, after all, he's in his late 70s. 8 years from now, there's a 50-50 chance he won't be alive. On the other hand, if Trump is elected, there's a decent chance that Nikki Haley could be the next Republican nominee in 2024. So that's interesting. Now, I don't think that Kamala Harris was chosen because of her Indian heritage. She was chosen for the other thing that you're bringing up, because her father is considered African American, was from Jamaica, and because Biden was struggling and trailing in the primaries until he won South Carolina based upon African American support, and it was really African American support that got him through to the nomination, and so that's why and he announced, as you know, that he was going to have a woman vice president. So very quickly it became African American women who seemed like they were the most likely people to be chosen, hence Kamala Harris as probably the most qualified person who fit that bill. The reason that there are a couple of reasons that race has become so important in the United States again. I mean, you're right. Ferguson in 2014, when an African-American young man was killed on a Ferguson Street, that sort of got the Black Lives Matter movement going. But then it was this past March, when George Floyd, there was this viral video, I'm sure that you all have seen it as well, where in Minneapolis, a police officer kneeled on the neck of George Floyd until he died. So, a video of minutes long, 9 minutes long, I think, showing he just continues to kneel on him and he dies in front of everybody's eyes. And that ignited a greater uprising of civil rights protests, and some of which turned violent than at any time in recent years, much bigger than what had followed Ferguson. Now, whether or not it may turn out, however, that the backlash to that Donald Trump is trying to ride, this the cities are dangerous, the cities are burning, the black people want to come to your suburbs, Biden wants to get rid of your suburbs, get rid of single family zoning, and have black people move in next door to you. I mean, that sort of very basic appeal, which has worked before in America, it could work again. One other thing, let me just mention one other thing. Race also got more attention even before George Floyd in the United States, because 2019 was the 400th anniversary of slaves being brought to the United States. New York Times did a very big project on this called the 1619 Project. It won a Pulitzer Prize. The main author was Nicole Hannah-Jones, where they made the argument that race was not a side story of American history, but the central story of American history. And that was very influential. I myself wrote a whole edition of a magazine I published called the Gateway Journalism Review that told the story of slavery, race, and segregation in St. Louis, Missouri, and Illinois, sort of a local view of that. So that's one of the reasons that race has gotten so much more attention.
So you've been a journalist forever now.
Yes.
What's your, relatively speaking, what's your assessment of this year's election? Which way is America going to vote, and how do you? Well, let me ask you how influential are the media going to be this time in the election, given that they kind of failed the people last time in merely predicting, but also did they bring up the right issues? Now, are the news media bringing up the right issues this time for the people? And therefore, both those things. I mean, what is your assessment, and then how do you think the media is going to influence the voter?
Well, I'm very leery of predicting who's going to win. I had thought that Biden and Harris were building up enough of a lead based on the polls, enough of a lead in the battleground states and across the country, and I also thought that there was this sort of enormous reaction. There is a huge reaction to Donald Trump. I mean, Donald Trump is viewed by more than 50% of the people as being, a bad president. His disapproval rating is over 50%. It would seem like his approval rating's around 42%. It would seem like that's a hard place to get reelected from. So I guess, if I had to put some money on this, I guess I would put it on Biden and Harris. But after the week, we're just at the end of the Republican National Convention, and I think they're doing. I mean, the president has been very deft at using the White House as like a prop, and his power as president as a prop during that convention. And they are, I think they are frightening some suburban, older white voters, and it might well begin to pick up in some of those battleground states.
So in fact, that's kind of my question as well, in terms of have the media really covered Trump fairly enough to be able to predict what you are saying, which is that there is a section that still remains uncovered by the media. And if Trump has actually fulfilled many of the promises that he made in 2016, as bizarre as they may sound to the media, which are mostly liberal, um, is it worth predicting one way or the other? Because we don't know whether the media have fairly covered Trump.
Right. I mean, for example, all of my friends think Trump is the worst president in the history of the United States. I have a nephew, however, who loves Trump, and who thinks Trump is not. You know, he doesn't care if Trump lies all the time. He thinks he also thinks that people like myself make the mistake of taking everything Trump says seriously. They think he thinks that Trump is hilarious, you know, very funny, and that, you know, that we pointy head intellectuals should realize that and shouldn't take him so seriously. Um, but yeah, I don't think, I think everybody should be very wary of the media's predictions in the election. They could be, it's very possible they could be as wrong this time as they were in 2016. And but they're, you know, in 2016, Trump had a very low, didn't have a majority approval rating either. I think the only time he ever had a majority approval rating was around the time he was inaugurated for about a week, and so you know, he found a way to draw. You know, if you'd use the poker analogy, he drew an inside straight by winning Michigan and Wisconsin and Pennsylvania, and by a total of 80,000 votes amongst them. That could happen again. But there's a lot of, you know, he won Florida, and Biden's ahead in Florida. He won Arizona, Biden's ahead in Arizona. So his inside straight has got to be not just 3 cards, but maybe more like 5 cards. It's still possible.
Bill, absolutely a pleasure talking to you again.
Great talking to you.
Thank you. So it's been 4 years that we discussed the election. I hope to catch you again for the next election as well, and see where we go from there. I'm not going to hold you to the prediction either, so don't worry about that too much.
Maybe it'll be Nikki Haley against Kamala Harris in 2024.
In 2024, as the Indian media is predicting. But thank you so much for your time.
Thank you. Great to talk to you again.
Great to talk to you again.